Okay, so imagine you're in 1970s Santa Rosa, California. Like a normal night, parents are dropping off their daughters, for a night out at the roller rink or a concert. But for some families, that ordinary night would become like a total nightmare. Their daughters just vanish.
Yeah, and some turn up tragically, along the highways, and it just changes the whole landscape of Santa Rosa.
Today, we're diving deep into these unsolved Santa Rosa hitchhiker murders.
A case that has haunted the area, gosh, for decades, really.
And we're going to try to unravel it all using this episode of the Morbid podcast,
Hmm.
the true crime one that you sent me. It really captures the fear,
Yeah, it does. Yeah, the way the episode describes that fear that gripped the entire community as these young women just disappeared.
one after another.
Yeah, one after another.
And that's what really got me. This wasn't just like a one-time thing. This was a string of disappearances and murders that spanned years.
Right. And that's where it gets so complicated right from the start. Like, are we dealing with one person, multiple people, or even just totally unrelated crimes that just happen to look similar?
Yeah,
That's the question investigators have been trying to answer for decades.
decades. So before we get into all the suspects and theories, let's talk about the victims. These were young women with lives, dreams, families who loved them.
Exactly. They weren't just names on a police report. I
Yeah.
mean, take 15-year-old Carolyn Davis.
Right.
The podcast talks about how she left a note for her mother before she disappeared,
Oh, wow.
saying she was just keeping herself alive. I mean, can you imagine the emotions her family must have felt? Worry, confusion, maybe even that little bit of hope that she was just off on some, I don't know, teenage adventure.
It's heartbreaking. And then there's Teresa Walsh, a 23-year-old mother,
Yeah.
hitchhiking home for Christmas to be with her 2-year-old son.
Wow.
Imagine that little boy growing up, always wondering what happened to his mom.
Oh, it's just awful. These stories, they're so poignant, and the podcast really does a good job of bringing those human elements to light.
Yeah.
But what makes this case stand out is the pattern, the eerie similarities between the victims and their disappearances.
It's like a chilling checklist, really.
Yeah.
So many were last seen hitchhiking, often along or near Highway 101.
Exactly. And then several were found nude at the bottom of embankments miles from where they were last seen, which suggests they were transported, probably murdered elsewhere, making it even harder to figure out where the crimes even took place.
But for me, the detail that really sends chills down my spine is the single earring.
Oh, yeah.
Several victims were found with just one earring. The other one never recovered.
Right.
It's like the killer was leaving a calling card, taking a trophy.
It's fascinating because it brings in that whole psychological aspect. Like, was this a way for the perpetrator to have control, to personalize the crimes, maybe even taunt investigators? I mean, those missing earrings, they've haunted this case from the beginning.
Oh, absolutely. And speaking of haunting, the podcast mentions a suspect that always gets people talking, the Zodiac Killer.
Right, right. Sheriff Don Stockey, he believed that some parts of the case lined up with what the Zodiac said, about burying victims and collecting slaves for the afterlife. But there's no, cryptic messages.
Right.
And the victims are different. So this theory, it's a bit less likely.
Yeah, it's interesting, though. And another name that comes up, in cases like this is Ted Bundy. Lori Curse's brother, he was convinced Bundy did it, especially since Bundy was in California around then.
He was, yeah, but his MO it usually involved blunt force trauma,
Yeah.
and strangulation was more common in the Santa Rosa cases.
Hmm.
That discrepancy, plus the type of victims Bundy usually went for, it casts doubt on it. But, I mean, we can't rule anyone out.
Definitely not. And then there's the Hillside Stranglers, Kenneth Bianchi and Angela Bueno. They were active in California, targeting young women. So at first glance, they seem like a pretty good fit.
Yeah, at first their timeline kind of matched up, but their confirmed crimes started later,
Uh-huh.
and their main spot was Southern California. So while their methods are similar, especially as strangulation, the geography and timing make them less likely.
Okay, so this is where things get interesting for me.
Okay.
The podcast talks about Frederick Manali. He was a creative writing teacher at Santa Rosa Junior College,
Okay.
and he died in a car crash in 1976. The same year the murders seemed to stop.
Oh, wow. What's interesting about Manali is they found a drawing in his things.
Really?
A sadomasochistic one depicting victim Kim Allen. That, combined with the fact that he had access to potential victims at the college, and he seemed to be interested in, darker themes,
Right.
it makes him a much more intriguing suspect.
Yeah, it's like those puzzle pieces suddenly fitting together.
Right, especially with the timing of his death, like when the murders end.
Exactly.
But then that begs the question, if it was Manali, where's the physical evidence?
Right.
Did he keep trophies? Was there a secret place where these crimes happen? These are the questions that keep people speculating about him.
Yeah, it's really interesting. The podcast also brings up Jack Alexander Boken. He was linked by DNA to a 1996 murder that was kind of similar to the Hitchhiker cases.
Right.
He lived near Santa Rosa during the time of the murders and had a history of violence against women.
Yeah, we can't ignore Boken. But he was only definitely linked to that one murder after the Hitchhiker murders were thought to have ended. So it makes his involvement in the earlier ones less certain.
Right, right. And then there's Jim Marai, Sierra Barter's step-grandfather,
Mm.
who she suspects
Oh, really?
in a recent documentary.
Uh-huh.
She says he was violent towards women
Uh-huh.
and even had a jewelry box full of mismatched earrings.
Oh, wow. Now that's interesting.
Right.
That possible link to the missing earrings. That's intriguing.
Yeah.
But without the actual earrings or any other solid evidence, Marai is just a speculative suspect.
Right. So we have a whole lineup of potential culprits, each with their own set of clues
Yeah.
and frustratingly unanswered questions. So where do we even go from here? I mean, what does it all mean?
Well, there is a little bit of hope. There's DNA evidence in some of the cases.
Okay.
And using familial DNA testing, that could uncover new leads and maybe finally bring some closure to the families who've waited so long for answers. You know, it's amazing to think about how far forensic science has come, especially, DNA technology. Like, just imagine if they had those tools back then in the 70s when these murders were happening.
I know, right? It's mind-blowing. Like even a partial DNA profile, you could run it through databases today. Maybe find relatives, through familial DNA matching. It's like a whole new way to fight for justice.
Exactly. But even without all that fancy tech, the investigators back then, they were sharp. Remember how they kept saying the spots where they found the bodies?
Yeah.
Those probably weren't the actual murder sites.
Right, right. That really stuck with me too. It makes you think about how planned out it was
Ab-
and how well they knew the area.
Mm.
Like the perpetrator had to have a place, a place where they could take the victims, where nobody would find them.
It really makes you wonder, could it have been someone with like a remote property, a cabin or something?
Yeah.
Or someone whose job, let them move around without being noticed, like what was mentioned in the podcast, maybe a delivery driver or even a utility worker.
It's chilling to think about. Someone just blending in while doing these horrible things. But then we have the whole mismatched earring thing,
Right.
which makes it seem more personal.
It does.
Like their signature in a way.
Yeah, and that's where the case gets even more twisted. Like, is this earring thing really part of how the killer operated? Or are we reading too much into it?
Yeah.
Vital clue or just a distraction? It's a question that has bugged investigators and, armchair detectives forever.
It's what makes these cold cases so interesting. You're always trying to sort through the information, figure out what's real, what's not.
Like a puzzle, but with really high stakes.
Dude.
And what I like about this morbid episode is it doesn't try to simplify things.
Yeah.
It wants you to think about the mystery, the evidence, and really dig in.
Absolutely. And they don't shy away from the details. I mean, let's be real. That's part of why people are drawn to true crime, right?
Yeah.
But they handle it respectfully, towards the victims and their families.
It's a tough balance. And I think they do it well, acknowledging how dark it is without sensationalizing it. Because at the end of the day, these are real people with real lives who are tragically lost.
You're so right. It's easy to get caught up in the whodunit part, but we can't forget the human cost. The families left behind, grieving, wondering. I mean, I was struck by how the reward for information kept going up.
It did.
Like this desperate plea, anything to help catch the killer.
It speaks volumes about the need for justice, that frustration of not knowing, and how limited the old ways of investigating were, when you're dealing with someone so clever and hard to catch.
They mentioned how the media eventually moved on.
They did.
The story faded from the headlines. Months turned into years.
Right.
But for those families, the pain, the search for answers, that never went away.
Never. And that's where podcasts like Morbid, they play an important role. They keep these cases alive. They get people talking. They remind us that even in the face of something so awful, the pursuit of truth and justice has to continue.
Powerful stuff. And speaking of continuing the pursuit, They mentioned that the Santa Rosa Sheriff's Office, they still consider these cases open,
They do?
actively investigating any new leads that come in.
Wow. That's incredible after all this time.
I know. And who knows, maybe this very deep dive will reach someone.
Yeah.
Jog a memory,
Yeah.
spark a connection. That could finally break the case wide open.
I hope so. Of all the suspects we talked about, the one that keeps coming back to me is Frederick Manali.
Yeah, the writing professor.
Yeah.
With that drawing of Kim Allen.
Yeah, it's creepy. It sticks with you.
It does. And the fact that the murder stopped so suddenly after he died in that car crash feels like more than just a coincidence.
It does make you think. Imagine if they could, exhume his body, get a DNA sample, compare it to the evidence from the victims.
Or even search where he used to live.
Yeah.
Maybe they'd find a stash of those missing earrings.
Right.
Or some other clue that connects him to the crimes, without a doubt.
It's a long shot. But it shows how even the smallest thing, the tiniest piece of evidence, could be the key to solving it all.
And that brings up something important.
Yeah.
True crime. It's not just entertainment.
No.
These cases, these stories, they represent real lives, real heartbreak. And the fight for justice, it never really ends.
You're absolutely right. And even without a clear answer, sometimes just revisiting these cases, looking at the evidence, keeping the memory of the victims alive, that can be a form of justice in itself.
It's like saying, we haven't forgotten.
Right.
We won't let these women be forgotten. Their stories deserve to be told.
Absolutely.
Their lives deserve to be remembered, beyond their tragic endings.
I agree. And that's something I really like about Morbid and episodes like this. They don't just give you the facts. They delve into the emotional impact, the societal impact,
Right.
how these crimes affect everyone, not just the victims and their families.
It reminds us that these cases, as awful as they are, can teach us about ourselves,
We can.
about our society,
Yes.
about the fight for justice and accountability.
They force us to confront some hard truths about the world and make us think, how can we stop this from happening again?
It all makes you think, what can we learn from these cases?
Yeah.
Not just about the killer, but about ourselves,
Yeah.
our society.
Yeah.
I mean, the 70s had this almost carefree attitude about hitchhiking. Like it was this symbol of freedom, adventure.
Yeah.
But tragically, it masked the real dangers out there.
It's interesting how this case, along with, Ted Bundy and the Zodiac, it changed things. Hitchhiking went from being normal, even romanticized, to something scary, suspicious. It shows how societal norms can shift so quickly because of what happens in the world.
It's like this dark undercurrent suddenly coming to the surface, exposing something we hadn't really faced before.
Yeah.
And for young women especially, those going out on their own, the world suddenly felt a lot less safe.
It raises a big question. How do we balance freedom with safety?
Right.
It's still relevant today with things like ride sharing and worries about personal security.
It's a tough balance. But I think these cases also show how strong communities can be. People coming together to demand answers, to support the families, to keep the pressure on law enforcement.
You're right. It reminds us that even in the face of something so horrible, there's this strength, this determination to find meaning and prevent it from happening again. Whether it's raising awareness, pushing for better safety measures, or just remembering the victims, we can honor their lives and make sure their stories continue to matter.
It's a responsibility we all share. And I think that brings us back to those missing earrings. Haunting and fascinating at the same time. If the killer was collecting them as trophies, where could they be now? Could they be tucked away in an old attic, hidden in a dusty box, just waiting to be found?
It's an intriguing thought that everyday objects could become chilling clues in a criminal investigation, holding secrets that could unlock a decades-old mystery.
Makes you think, like what ordinary things in our own lives might have some hidden story behind them? A connection to the past that we never even knew about.
Right. That's a good question. I mean, we often think of evidence as being something big, a weapon, fingerprints, that kind of thing. But sometimes it's the everyday stuff that cracks the case wide open. A button, a piece of fabric.
A single earring.
Exactly.
Speaking of those earrings, I keep coming back to them. Like, let's just say those were taken as trophies.
Okay.
What does that tell us about whoever did this?
Well, it definitely says something about them planning it out, wanting to make the crimes personal, maybe even needing to feel powerful, in control,
Yeah.
over the victims.
Right. It's a scary thought.
It is, but it could be a key piece of the puzzle,
And the fact those matching earrings, they were never found. It's like they just disappeared.
Yeah.
Could they be hidden somewhere, just waiting for someone to find them?
It's possible. Imagine somebody's cleaning out their attic or an old box and they come across a bunch of mismatched earrings.
Wow.
That could be the break investigators have been waiting for all this time.
It really makes you think. Sometimes the answers are right there in front of us, hidden in plain sight. It also makes me think about the families,
Yeah.
still waiting after all these years.
Oh.
The podcast mentioned the Santa Rosa Hitchhiker murders are still an open investigation.
They are.
So what would you say to someone who might have information, even if they think it's not important?
I would say don't dismiss anything. You know, a memory, something you saw, it might seem small, but it could be that missing piece. Contact the Sonoma County Sheriff's Office. You just never know. Your information could be what finally brings peace to those families and closes this whole chapter in Santa Rosa's history.
It's true. We all have a part to play in finding justice. Sometimes it's as simple as speaking up, sharing what we know, no matter how small it seems.
And that's what we've tried to do today. Shine a light on this case, look at the theories, get our listener thinking. These cases, as tragic as they are, they remind us that the search for truth, for justice, it never really ends. It takes being aware, being compassionate, and being willing to face the darkness that's out there.
Well said. This has been a fascinating and honestly a really sobering look at the Santa Rosa Hitchhiker murders. Thanks for taking us through it all, the evidence, the theories, the unanswered questions.
It was my pleasure. And to our listener, we hope this deep dive has sparked your interest, got you thinking about this case. Remember, even the coldest cases can be solved with the right information. If you know anything at all, please reach out to the authorities. You could be the one to make all the difference.